Last week we didn't quite finish the lesson that was on the Constitution, capitalistic system, many things about the Constitution, but there's a couple of charts that I didn't finish that I would like to do at this time, and I may not finish tonight. We had talked about the greatness of our constitutional system, and we were down to the point where we're talking about the fight against business, how they regulate and maneuver it and control it, and they try to create in the minds of the American people that big business is bad. These big businesses are swindling you, they're doing this and that and everything. And profit is made a dirty word. The government should do it because they wouldn't charge a profit. Now they charge much more for what they do and the inefficiency with which they do it, but they don't make a profit. They take it out of your pocket. Ford was one that was criticized. They said, this man has $1 billion. Now, $1 billion then would be about 100 billion today because the dollar is just going like that. But that was a terrible thing. Well, where was this $1 billion? Was it in the cash? Was it in his pocket? Was it in banks? It was invested in land and factories and equipment. He had 250,000 employees working for him. The equipment and tools, supplies for one employee averaged $17,000. You know where his money was? It was working for you by giving people jobs to make cars. Made cars for millions. Henry Ford put us on wheels. There'd been some, Hupmobile and a few others had started cars, but they did not have mass production. They were very expensive and only the rich could afford them. But Henry Ford created the assembly line method of manufacturing, where people stood and each one would put a part and go on. They could start a car down here and 2 hours later a finished car comes out. And so in 1927 you could buy a nice Model T Ford sedan for $750. It takes capital to operate. Many businesses never have enough money to operate. They're always operating on borrowed money. They borrow money from the bank until they can collect their sales in. They paid $2 a day in those days, but $60 a month was a pretty good wage. $60 a day is not much. The New American had an article on the willingness to give, and it shows that the American people are the most generous people that ever existed. It tells them millions and millions of dollars they've given out for earthquake relief, flood relief, famine, sickness, all sorts of causes. And so without the free enterprise system, they would not be able to do that. So I'm staunchly in favor of the constitutional enterprise system. By the way, since it's President's Day, we barely acknowledge it. I did invite George Washington again. And whether we celebrate him on the 22nd or the 11th or yesterday doesn't make any difference, but I'll come down because part of our lecture tonight will recur to fundamental principles of the Constitution and Satan's plan, his substitute for the Constitution, the effort, the New World Order, the United Nations, a united military organization to take the military away from all other nations, including ours. And there they spell America. A world court of the protections that we have, no habeas corpus, no counsel, no witnesses. You stand before that court of pleas, you have nothing. The world court is that any United States citizen can be taken to the world court under court of judges from various around the world. Deals are nothing like ours. The religion is not like ours. Now, any violation of a UN order, and one of them is a hate crime. You know what a hate crime is? How would you define hate? Hate can be defined as anything. You make a slurring remark or innocent remark about somebody, and if they're after you, that's a hate crime. Off to nice trip. The world religion. Now, the United Nations, as we bring out later, is completely godless. They do not allow the mention of God. They do not allow prayer. They have one little room, a place which they call a meditation room, and they have a grotesque statue in there. And anybody that wants religion can go in there and meditate and pray if he wants to. But that's all that they allow. Slave labor, and who do you think will be slaves? Secret police, breaking up the family. The UNESCO, United Nations Child and Educational Association, has put out educational programs and child programs that cannot help but demean and tear down the families. Mind control, abject poverty. On this wonderful Constitution, we have the great prosperity and freedom and righteousness that we have. The fact that we're shifting this way, we're getting immorality, irreligion, bad laws, crime, many things. The farther we shift this way, the worse we get, because we become like them. On charity, a little food for thought. Here's a little food for thought about what is right with American business. Mr. Dixon, who gave this, said, what are some of the things businesses do besides make a reasonable profit? Here are a few. They pay dividends. See, businesses sell bonds to people. They invest in these businesses, which give them the capital to operate on. And then when they make profits, they pay dividends. It's a means of investment for people. They pay 1/2 of all Social Security taxes. They provide more than 90 million jobs, and today it's even more than that. But our job market is shrinking because illegal aliens are taking many of our jobs, and not just farm jobs. They're taking many positions in high places. They pay all unemployment taxes. They pay part of a workman's compensation insurance. They contribute more than $1 billion annually to worthwhile charity and educational causes, and that's more than that now. They provide income to millions of Americans. They provide various fringe benefits to employees' children, health facilities, and so forth. They spend billions of dollars on research to develop products that enhance the health and enjoyment of the American citizen. Isn't it amazing the stream of new inventions is coming? We're going to hardly keep up with it. Cell phones or iPods or new kitchen appliances or whatever it is. They pay income taxes to help finance the government and its many welfare programs. They encourage its executives and employees to devote millions of company time hours in volunteer work for charitable, health, educational, arts, and many other such enterprises. So, the American businessman his dues. And I really believe that most businessmen are true. The things you see in a newspaper are always a negative. The newspaper doesn't come out and say, well, we haven't found an honest businessman today. These businessmen are honest. They don't make any stories. They make their money off the lurid, evil things. So much for that. The United Nations. During World War II, we were sick of war. World War I was fought, and those who thought, two classes of thought. One is that we don't want any more war. The way to stop war is for everybody to disarm. Just cancel all of them, and then they can't fight a war. The other side, who knew that disarmament was the way to take over the world, were quoting it. So they were wanting no more war. Well, when World War II broke out, the United States was very resistant. Highly, the people were against it. The United States was beginning to give aid to Britain and aid to France, supplies and so forth. Churchill and Roosevelt met on a boat off the coast to discuss how we could get Americans to accept the war. And Roosevelt said, it'll take some great tragedy. He said, like bombing Pearl Harbor. The week before Pearl Harbor was bombed, President Roosevelt said, and this is brought out from people, that he said they will always attack on a Sunday. It will either be the last Sunday in the December, and you know it was December the 7th. And so Roosevelt ordered all of our aircraft carriers off to the South Seas and left most of our Navy in Pearl Harbor, surrounded like this. And then on the Saturday night, they had tremendous parties. Many of the soldiers were out most of the night, and lying in their bed. The code people had broken the code and said there are Japanese planes on the... That message received in Washington, and it was taken immediately to Admiral General. He said, well, send it by regular mail. It arrived after the attack. This sounds pretty vicious, and it may sound absolutely unbelievable to you, but it is proved. Admiral Kimmel and General Short were court-martialed. All the blame was placed on them. They didn't get the armies. They should have been up. They should have been alert. They had to place the blame on somebody, so they did. But in the court-martial, all of these things were brought out. But does a newspaper ever tell you that? I wrote several letters to the editor on Pearl Harbor for a few years. And boy, the bite back was ferocious. I got a telephone call, a man from Glenn, he says, my name is so and you are so disloyal. He said, I've got $300,000 and I'll spend every dollar of it to destroy you. Well, you know, that was just a threat. It didn't bother me. But the newspapers attacked my letters, and after a while they did more, and I quit writing them. Now, that shows the terrible, insidious background to get us into the war. Now, in the war, of course, it was a terrible thing. Our brother Johnny was killed, and many, maybe your relatives, killed. It was a terrible thing, and we didn't want any more war. And we had these slogans built up in favor. Nations are separated, there's always war. If we can get them all together, why, we can have talking instead of fighting. It's the last hope we have for peace. The United Nations is the last hope we have. Bring equality, they eradicate disease, banish poverty, save the children, welfare, all these wonderful things, because all these nations will meet together and talk it over. One of the quotations says that if we get together and talk about our quarrels where everybody can help solve them, we'll solve them. Never Taft Benson said that's as ludicrous as a man and a wife arguments and gathering all the neighbors around to come in and settle it. All right. These slogans. See, during the war, they were building us up for the United Nations. So what is the United Nations? Well, they say it's an assembly of peace-loving nations. I suppose that the Russians coming into the United Nations suddenly just love peace and want to cooperate and so forth. The Parliament of Man a forum for world problems, represent all the peoples. The peoples have never been represented. The representatives have been chosen from nations of the people that they wanted in there. Most nations have never had any opportunity to vote on the United Nations. World government under world law, that sounds good. We're going to have world law, and therefore the government will work. Peace organization, mankind's last hope. Wonderful if true. Now keep in mind that we brought out that the aim of communism is to destroy the United States and conquer the world. UN was planned by communists far in advance. In the writings of Lenin and Stalin, they had 5 goals in which they would prepare for the United Nations, various conferences, nations getting together and talking about that. And it ended in 1945 with the Yalta Conference, when Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill went to Yalta to discuss it. And they were completely dominated by Stalin. But they agreed there that they would work for United Nations, and that a visit on the ocean by Roosevelt and Churchill was part of that plan. It was organized by communists. Organized by communists. Now you say, well, who organized the United States? Well, Alger Hiss. Anybody remember Alger Hiss? Alger Hiss was one of the most prominent politician office holder in our country. He held several high positions in the presidency. He was Assistant Secretary of State for many years, controlling much of the state return policy. He was a communist. He was carrying out their plans. Well, he was made the Secretary General of the United Nations in San Francisco to organize it. He brought 400 of his people in. These were not elected, they were not appointed by the Congress, or people that he selected and brought into the United Nations. The UN staff, the people in leadership, they had represented in several other nations, but all of our United States representatives were part of the group under HIS. The tour guides, you go to the United Nations and you will receive a tour. The guides will explain in the United Nations. They think something's wrong and we need to correct it, but largely they have been influenced to think power there that works for us. They do not understand it. But the intent is to move us into the United Nations. Instead of a sovereign nation, we would be a province of the United Nations. Sound good? I have many agencies. I remember I mentioned UNESCO, but they have many others that do with the laws of the seas and immigration controls and many things by which they want to control the entire world. They have NGOs, non-governmental organizations. Many of those are organizations that are formed with private people, and they work with the United Nations. They carry out projects for them. And it's a propaganda machine that never exceed with any. Well, after it's organized, it was controlled by the communists. I think I explained before that in my opinion, according to the book of Daniel, the book of Revelation, that was a great beast with two heads. And it said the first head was killed, and to everybody's amazement, it came alive again. The League of Nations, the United Nations. And frankly, I think the reference, Babylon the Great, is the United Nations, everything I can see. And now the book of Revelation was to tell what would happen in the last days. When are the last days? How can they get much laster than now? So if that isn't it, where would you look for it? It's like the restored gospel. It was to come in the latter days, in the last days. Now, is there any place on earth other than the restored gospel that claims to be? No. I brought out before that religion and politics are two hands on the same body. They have to move together. We're supposed to hammer out a charter. All these nations get together and work out a charter. That sounds very democratic and wonderful, but the charter was written before they ever went there, and it was piecemealed out and read back in, and so they worked together and brought together all these wonderful ideas for a charter, and the charter was already written. The principles of the Russian Constitution are matched in the UN Charter and many others, but the Russian Constitution provides everything that people could want: freedom, religion, welfare, work, everything, but in fine print it says only insofar as the Russian government allows. And the Charter of Nations, I've given away hundreds of these because nobody ever heard of them. I've talked to legislators and congressmen, they never heard of it, they've never seen it. But the United Nations Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted by the United Nations, a great declaration of human rights that just everything you could think of, anything that our Declaration gives us or anything. But at the end it says, only insofar as approved by the United Nations. Wipe it out with the fine print. Well, the United States is the richest nation on earth. We can finance it to get started, and then all the other nations will come in. Well, the years go by and the other nations don't come in. We were furnishing much of the money to start it, and we've been furnishing around 43. Here, a report by Adlai Stevenson. This is a UN General Assembly 17th session by Adlai E. Stevenson. You ever heard of Adlai Stevenson? Candidate for president? Our representative of the UN. He glorifies the United Nations and all its accomplishments. The UN and the Cuban crisis, when the Soviets threatened to put Cuba missiles, boy, they raised big cane and so forth, and they took it up with the United Nations, and Kennedy threatened to invade and so forth. And so the Russians took one step backward. Okay, we agree. All right, they solved it. Do you think they have missiles in Cuba now? They do have. All right, that's one great accomplishment of the UN. Another one was the effort on the Congo. They were taking over the Congo. They were having rebellion there, a war, and so they took it to the United Nations, and the United Nations favored for the communists who were taking it over. And that's the way to solve that great crisis, and so on. And then he comes to the question of financing. He says the great problem is financing it. We've got to continue financing it until these other nations begin to see how wonderful it is and contribute their share. We're still waiting. 8 and a Bit is a little police magazine. It's published by Jack McLam, who wrote that article on treaties. And many years ago, he asked me if I would write an article on the United Nations. He had heard me speak on it, and he said, I'd like to do a special book on the United Nations. So here it is, written about 35 years ago, and I wouldn't take back anything I have said there about it. Now, this magazine has a distribution of about 6,500 policemen and military. Later, they wrote and told me, we have had requests for 40,000 more copies that we have printed and distributed. So if you think that I'm a novice and don't know anything about the United Nations, why, I plead that after much study and listening to the authorities and the experts and knowing the background of it and knowing the background in the League of Nations. See, I'm 90 years old. I can remember World War I. Most of you can't remember World War II. But I was pleased that they thought that almost 50,000 copies with the original edition has gone someplace. I don't know what good it's done, but it's out there. All right, let's continue with our charts. Now this was 32 years after 1945. How much is that? So it's about 40 years ago. So you can add 40 years to that. At that time, there were 60 million people. In Russia, they deliberately killed many of the Russians who were opposed to the Russian government. They starved them to death. They killed them. There are billion slaves in Russia and other places just brought into abject slavery. They threw the Iron Curtain down between the East and West to prevent travel back and forth. Worldwide subversion. The United States in a grave danger, far more than people realize. The United Nations are moving forward according to their schedule. If any of you take the New American, a special report on the North American Union. The plans for easing us into the United Nations included, one, creating a united euro with the euro dollar nations together in an organization. It's almost fallen apart because they're having a lot of trouble. The second one was to do the same thing in South America, which they've done, and then to bring South America and the United States and Canada all one. And if any of you are aware of NAFTA, one of the great things it's in our legislature and the Congress, every effort being made to push NAFTA. And NAFTA, North American Trade Association, provides opening the borders to trade from Canada and Mexico, South America. Mexican ships that can hardly break down on the highway and cause accidents bring their produce in here to sell. But they're building a super highway through Mexico, Texas, United States. Highway can be used for troops, military, or whatever. Now, our country is going ahead with that. The John Birch Society has carried on to get us out of the UN program for all these years. They haven't gotten us out yet, but they're still trying. Part of as Canada and the United States business, the same do in South America. When they have these Troika, three, then they plan to move them into the United Nations. One of the great achievements the United Nations that Adlai Steven mentioned was that they added greatly to the number. There were 90 nations when they first started. There are 190 now, but at that time they had added 30 more nations, and he was just elated. But he didn't tell you that there's 30 nations were little postage stamp-sized nations organized by the communists and their leaders brought in to vote as the way the communists tell them to vote. This thing is so open and apparent that it's hard for me to believe that Americans can't see it. But the great educational program that's going on has blinded their eyes to it. Anyway, that's legislation that is on the front burner cooking now. And everybody that should write their senators, legislators. You say, well, what would my letter do? I don't have time, or I don't know who he is or what it is. Well, there are ways to find out. There's a number you can call the state legislature, and they'll give you the telephone number or the email address of any legislature. Lator. Now, I didn't want to phone this morning for people, but I did. I don't know what effect it'll have. I've known the Tibbs-Sheranian Chandler family for years. I don't know Jay personally, but I knew his father. Jay was mayor of Chandler. He's been quite a good senator for us, but he was on the wrong side of this question, so I phoned him to tell him to look at it and straighten up on it. Would you say the UN is a failure or is it a growing success, as Adlai Stevenson said? Well, we get down to the cold truth. It's godless and it's God-forsaken. If you pass a law, if you tell him to stay out of your life, he will. If you tell him to stay out of the United Nations, he will. Now, overall, he's going to rule it. He's going to control it. And we may go through some terrible times, blood and chains, but everybody can do something. Then you're voting. You can call your legislators. I asked Russell Pierce, I said, Russell, you know how I feel. I support you and everything. Do you want letters from me? I said, you put your stacks of mail. He said, one letter from you, as you're known, and I hold up, is worth a stack of letters. No. So, and I have so many things to do that I don't have time to write a lot of letters and emails, but I still try to do some. And I think if everybody would do what little he can do, first thing, there would be an education effort. We'd tell our children, our parents, our friends, others about these things. They won't learn it in the newspaper. In the newspapers and popular magazines, they will learn just the opposite. They will learn what a wonder it is. Well, mistakes and weaknesses, but it's always, we must get in and strengthen it. They don't say we must get out. Well, the stronger we make it, the worse we're in for. Here's one of the billboard signs that the John Birch Society has tried to put in lots of places. Signs of the times. Fight terrorism, get us out of the United Nations. Get us, U.S., out of the UN. Monday, February 19th, Mesa Tribune. Model UN teaches kids the ways of the world. Last weekend, some 30 Westwood students joined more than 300 East Valley students at Mesa Community College for the annual Model United Nations Conference. By taking the role of delegates from assigned countries, this one's from Chile and this one's from, they represent those countries. They work together to create resolutions. Students must realistically portray their country's stance as if they knew. And it says that it gives a name to the teacher here, and in the same, people are teaching our students who don't know beans from an anthill. It is utter shame. Anyway, it goes on to say, the Westwood students also take an evening international relations course at Mesa Community College, which means they're allowed to attend a college-level Model United Nations Conference in San Francisco. Oh, that's wonderful. They get trips to San Francisco, they get trips to Washington, D.C., the UN building, and they impress all their people with what a wonderful thing the United Nations is. Then just in my files, I don't know what the date on this one is. Model United Nations delegates to take in international knowledge to New York. Much the same, East Valley students prepare for a nationwide meeting. Every year, even down to the small grades, they are taught the greatness of the United Nations. So when the newspapers continue to, I guess it's no wonder that people believe the United Nations is a great thing. It's going to bring us peace if we can just work with them and straighten them out and keep them financed and keep them going. Why, eventually they'll work it out and they'll work us in. One of the great fears of the United States, and they didn't have much of a chance to express these because they were not informed of what was going on. Our senators are about as ignorant as the man on the street when they voted for the United Nations Treaty. But if they could, well, I guess if they knew the Constitution, they should recognize immediately that it violates it at every step. That would be the basic. So I guess they should recur to the fundamental principles first, and they would. But to teach our children in school about the United Nations is part of the program to convince our students that we should not be a one nation, we should be a one world people. We have people here from many countries, England, Ireland, Spain, Italy. We're just a diverse nation. We trade with other nations. We should just be one great world family. And so they're prepared for that. Now, of the 100 nations that have joined since the original 90, most of them are not nations that would have our ideals, our religion, our Constitution principles in the slightest. Who are they to be making rules for us? Why are we not in there promoting our Constitution? Was Adlai Stevenson there selling them on the principle of the Constitution? In no way he was. Incidentally, all of our representatives of the United Nations through years that I have seen have been of this liberal mentality. Never have they appointed people to the United Nations who are knowledgeable of it and could go in and work against it. We have a wonderful man. I've met and talked with him about it, who's done a great job in the United Nations. He's not a delegate, but he has attended, been assigned there. He was assigned there to make a speech on the family. The United Nations was considering making laws for the family. Now, do you see any reason why the world should make laws of how your family should be run? But anyway, and some of their laws were very destructive. And so he presented the World Proclamation on the Family, read it to them. Had a tremendous effect. Many of the nations then voted against their proposition. And I thought that was wonderful. Well, I talked to him and commended for him, but I said, that will continue on and on. We need to get out. Oh, I said, we need to stay in there and work to reform them. And that's a principle they have. It's a propaganda agency, a step-by-step to world government, and an instrument for communist world conquest. Here's the last chart on it. What to do? Get out or go under. There are no alternatives. If we do not get out, we will go under. We should exert our constitutional principles, put Americans' interest first. We should have traditional diplomacy. People say, well, it's good that we can meet with all these representatives from all the world and discuss our problems. Well, why should we be discussing our problems with France with people from Ethiopia and Russia and communist China? Doesn't make sense, does it? And so the constitutional way of ambassadors, the president shall have power to appoint ambassadors and consuls. And with that, and then with the Senate Senate approval required on treaty, we have a wonderful protection if the Senate minds its business, because they keep the president from getting these things done. The judiciary of the United Nations is a frightful thing. I've explained it a little bit about the World Court. The World Court is now in operation. In very recent years, the World Court has been approved. The United States fought it for many years. They opposed it. Almost everything the United States has done has been opposed by wise men such as Congressman Utt and many others who have presented speeches. I have many speeches made to the Senate and the House on the evils of the United Nations. I don't know whether they don't listen or whether they're under some kind of duress or pressure that they can't, or whether they're just ignorant, or whether some of them are part of this conspiracy. I don't know. But whatever they are delinquent in their duty. They are violating the Constitution. They are giving aid and comfort to the enemy. Where does that come in the Constitution? The definition of treason. What is the worst crime that can be committed? Treason. Because treason affects the life of everybody in the nation. And so that's the reason that the punishment for treason is capital. So these are very serious things. Americans need to know them. They need to shut off that television and study some of the things that you're studying. How far your influence will go, I don't know, but how far my influence goes, I don't know. The World Court, now that it is effective in the United States, and among my souvenirs, the United States State Department acknowledges the supremacy of the United Nations. They acknowledge that we are under the United Nations. It was only a matter of time until the United States answered to the United Nations for human rights violations. The United States has gone through its first self-flagellation, groveling before the United Nations as required by the treaty, the court treaty of 2 years ago. Under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the United States has to account to the United Nations Human Rights Committee for its conduct. So the State Department submitted a 216-page compliance report apologizing to the world government because some states execute murderers. Some local police officers reported were less than gentle in handling violent criminals. Now that's the type of thing. Their laws are working down right into our local police and to our families. In 1945, the United States Senate formally recognized and approved the establishment of the United Nations organization. This treaty was guided through the Congress by Alger Hiss, a State Department official and personal advisor to President Roosevelt. Alger Hiss was later exposed as a communist agent. I think I mentioned it before, but when the charges were made against him before the Senate committee, he refused to testify. Beneath his dignity. My record speaks for itself. Look at all the wonderful things done in Secretary of State, all the many things I've done. It's an insult even to question me. But they finally pinned him down. He evaded his questions. They'd ask him a question and he'd change the subject and talk about something else. Every way trying to evade the questions, because one of his partners, forgotten his name too, was in the Communist Party with him. He broke from the Communist Party and he wrote a book revealing the many things they did and revealing what Alger Hiss, I wish I brought that in here so I remember his name, but this man who wrote the book was vilified. High people in the United States criticized him for making these charges against this great man, but pinning down question after question, pinned him right down to the point he had to answer, and he lied. He said, no, I was not. And the writer of this book brought up some incidents that Alger Hiss had done and brought it into question, and Alger, oh yes, and that he revealed the whole thing, that he had been lying. Well, perjury was the only thing they could get him for because the statute of limitation had passed. You know, they have a statute of limitation. You commit a crime more than 7-9 years ago, they can't bring it up in court. So the perjury was late enough that they could convict him of that, so he served 3.5 years in prison for perjury, and he never held another position. In later years, they tried to clean him up and work him in, but he was never accepted again. Since that time of Alger Hiss, patriots in the United States have been trying in vain to alert and awaken their fellow Americans to the long-planned conspiracy to undermine the United States Constitution, disarm the American people, transfer our military forces to UN command, and merge the U.S. into a world government. In the process, the people will give up their rights and liberties, their standard of living, their property and wealth, their freedom of speech. Throughout history, John Shattuck, Assistant Secretary of State, wrote in the report, the United States has experienced egregious human rights violation in the ongoing struggle for justice. The report apologizes for slavery of more than a century ago, the destructive Native American culture, the ill treatment of illegal aliens, and denial of rights to women. All these terrible things the United States is guilty of. They've been brought before the United Nations. It's part of conditioning the minds of Americans to accept a world government in which the United States will ultimately surrender all sovereignty, said a career State Department official who has tracked the movement for years. Each year we will read short news stories about the United Nations accounting to the world body for its behavior, the United States accounting to the world body for its behavior, and the public will be conditioned to accept the fact the United Nations is the ultimate government. They will give up their freedom of speech, their beloved Constitution, as they become submerged in the New World Order. And that picture I drew will show you what we give up piece by piece. A young woman is about to finish her first year at college. Like so many others her age, she considered herself to be a very liberal Democrat and was very much in favor of redistribution of wealth. She was ashamed that her father was a rather staunch Republican, a feeling she openly expressed. Based on the lectures that she had participated in and the occasional chat with her professor, she felt that her father for years harbored an evil, selfish nature to keep what he thought should be his. One day she was challenging his father on his opposition to higher taxes on the rich and the addition of more government welfare programs. The self-professed objectivity proclaimed by her professors had to be the truth, and she indicated so by her father. The rich should be taxed to help the poor. He responded to ask how she was doing in school. Taken aback, she answered rather haughtily she had a 4.0 grade point average, and let him know it was tough to maintain, insisting she was taking a very difficult course load and was constantly studying, which left her no time to go out and party like other people she knew. She didn't even have time for a boyfriend and didn't really have many college friends because she spent all her time studying. Her father listened and asked, "How is your friend Audrey doing?" She replied, "Audrey is barely getting by. All she takes are easy classes. She never studies. She barely has a 2.0 grade point average. She is so popular on campus college. She's invited to all the parties and lots for classes because she's too hungover." Her wise father asked his daughter, "Why don't you go to the dean's office and ask him to deduct 1 point off your grade average and add it to her grade average, and then you'll both have 3.0 grade average and you'll be equal." The daughter was visibly shocked, and she angrily fired back, "That wouldn't be fair. I worked really hard for my grades. I've invested a lot of time and a lot of hard work. Audrey has done nothing, next to nothing to her degree. She played while I worked my tail off." Father slowly smiled and winked and said, "Welcome to the Republican Party." Thank Marlene for that. It was pointed out to me that on Pearl Harbor I explained all the plans to bring it about, that I never did say that the Japanese attacked. So I'll tell you, the Japanese did attack, and as I told you, the code caught the planes as they were coming in, and those pilots had orders that if the defenders were ready, they should turn back. And they had people up on a hill with a bonfire. If that bonfire was set, it meant that the people knew they were coming and were ready, and they would not attack. J. Reuben Clark, I've mentioned before, the great expert on international affairs and expert on the UN. Shortly after the UN Charter was accepted, newspaper reporters went to him and asked him for his appraisal of it. He said, "Well, I just glanced at it, but offhand, a cursory thing, I'd say that it's not a charter for peace, it's a charter for war." And he said it will have our troops preaching all over the, assigned all over the world in foreign countries. And today we have troops in 41 countries. And he said we will have no control over where our troops are sent. And we will have no control over how they're armed. And that's coming very quickly. All these wars are part of the plan to weaken our military and turn it over to the United Nations, and to police our cities with Mongolian or Cuban troops. Now, if that makes you women comfortable, his cursory report was not published for several years, and after he died, his family published it. I couldn't find my copy of it today. I was sorry I couldn't, but it's very interesting, which he lays out the things just as they have come to pass in the past 60 years. I mentioned before that W. Cleon Skousen was the communist director, the director of the communist affairs of the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover. He investigated, he made all the reports to Congress, he made the recommendations, and he wrote the book, The Naked Communist, in which he exposed all their plans and everything. And at one point, he said the creation of the United Nations. During August and September 1944, representatives of Britain, China, Russia, and the United States met at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C. At this conference, the constitutional foundation for the United Nations was laid. And by the way, Alger Hess was our representative there. So, in it, Russia was not only made a full partner, but a dominant stockholder. See, we've supposedly been at war with Russia all these years, hadn't we? The atomic bomb, they have the bomb, and we must be careful. If they drop a bomb on us, we'll destroy the world. And all these years, and every place the communists threatened, we sent billions of dollars of aid to those countries, hundreds of billions of dollars in foreign aid to fight communism, but to prop up socialist governments in those countries. A most significant development was the fact that while other nations objected, Russia insisted on the right to exercise the veto power even if she were a party to the dispute. Now, it'd be nice if you were charged with something to go to court and you had the power to nullify the decision. All right. The veto power was one of the big arguments that lured us into it, preparation for the United Nations. The fear that the United Nations would make some rules harmful to us, contrary to us. And they said, well, we'll have the Security Council, 15 nations will be in the Security Council, all the other nations will be in the General Assembly. The General Assembly will handle all the domestic, the international affairs and things like that. The Security Council will be the watcher over it, and there'll be 5 permanent members, and they will hold permanent positions. Our delegate to the UN would be rotated as we could, but all 5 of those would have the veto power. So that anything against the United States, we could veto it. So we have no worry at all. We can go in and anything that we don't like, we can veto. The United States used the veto one time on some trivial matter. The Russian used the veto more than 100 times on every bill that was put in, veto after veto. And the United States never raised problem or objected to it. And so they have been in control. Now, think of it. Here's a nation that since 1914 has sought to control the world. They took over their own people. They got rid of the Tsar and all the leaders, and they brought in their communists. They killed millions of people to bring them into line. They had their secret police, GPN. They had a rule of terror. People were afraid to even talk to a neighbor. They had the secret police. If I were assigned to report on Verna everything she did or said, I did not dare report because somebody is assigned to watch me to see that I did. For even members of their own family did not dare trust. And children were taught to tell on their parents. Have your parents said God? Have they said, have you had prayers? And questions like this, and children answer. Well, 4 o'clock in the morning, the father's off to Siberia. It was an absolute reign of terror all these years, and they made clear that their objective was to destroy, or to conquer the world, to destroy the United States system and conquer them, to raise the red flag all over the world. Now, with 40 years of that kind of enmity, suddenly they're friends. They're coming in now. We're all going to get together and have this wonderful organization, and we're going to be the dominant one in it. We're going to be the head man, but we'll work for peace and prosperity and happiness and the end of war and all these things. Can anybody believe that they changed their leopard spots overnight? How could we be so foolish as to believe that these people, godless, openly enmity to us, would be any better when we gave them the key to the bank and the rule of the court. Now, in the United Nations since then, they have stymied almost every good thing that is brought before them. It's a slow process. They can't just stand up today and say, we're conquerors of the world. You're going to say it has to be piecemeal. If they had said the very first day, turn your military over to us, well, there would have been great objection. But piece by piece, surrender a little here and there. The old salami there. You cut off a little slice, not worth fighting about, a little more, well, that's a little piece. Pretty soon it's more than half, and then not enough left to fight about. And that was part of the organization that I showed you a picture of, the wolf in sheep's clothing. That was their slogan. They took the name from that. Russia insisted on the right to exercise a veto power even if she was a party to dispute. This violated the very foundation of international jurisprudence, but the other countries consented. They were so anxious to make Russia friendly. Roosevelt said, the Russians are just afraid of us. We're rich and powerful. I give them everything they ask for to show them that we're friendly, so that they will drop their fear and don't want to fight. They want to come in and be like we are. That's a great theory for a president of the United States. By December 28, 1944, the American ambassador to Russia began to express misgivings about U.S.-Soviet relations and the part play in the post-war period. He said, the Soviets have definite objectives in their future foreign policy, all of which we do not fully understand. From Soviet actions so far, the term friendly and independent appears to mean something entirely different to them than it does to us. And I think I mentioned doublespeak before, and when we get into education, I'm going to bring out some elements of how they twist their words so that when they talk about peace and freedom and so forth, they're talking about the peace when there's no opposition to communism, and freedom when they're free to do what they want to. It doesn't mean the same to them as it does to us. Once the tide of war had turned, there was increased arrogance in Soviet treatment of U.S. officials. General Dean wrote to Washington about Lend-Lease and said, even our giving him Lend-Lease is viewed with suspicion. There again, we said, the Russians are so poor, they have to do this. Let's give them Lend-Lease. Lend, and you never get it back. They give it a name to sound like it's not a gift, but it is. They never repay any of it. The party of the second part, the U.S., he said, even our giving is viewed with suspicion. The party of the second part, the United States, is either a shrewd traitor to be admired or a sucker to be despised. I have yet to see the inside of a Russian home. Officials dare not become too friendly with us, and others are persecuted for this offense. The Russians had tourist tours. They would take Americans around and show them all the wonderful things Russians were doing. They'd take them to home and show them the wonderful families they had. Well, these were just facades set up. They'd have these things set up like this, while the rest of Russia was in poverty and terrible. And so people go to Russia and come back saying, oh, the Russians, communism is working wonderfully. They're getting equality, they're getting welfare, the people are happy, the government officials are good. But that was just a sideshow that they ran for tourists. By the following April, the Prime Minister of England was becoming fed up with the whole Russian picture. He appealed to President Roosevelt, I deem it of the highest importance that a firm and blunt stand should be made at this juncture by our two countries in order that the air may be cleared and they, the Russians, realize there's a point at which we will not tolerate insult. There is some evidence the President of the United States also began to weaken to the realities of the situation, but 1 week after the message written, President Roosevelt died. The monumental task of finishing the war and building the United Nations fell in the hand of those who still insisted the Russians were being misunderstood and that a successful partnership could be definitely achieved. On April 25, 1945, 1,400 representatives from 40 nations, 400 from the United States, and I've told you who picked them, after due deliberation, and I told you what that deliberation was. It was a acceptance of the principle they'd already prepared. I've been in school meetings and city meetings and seen them plan these things very carefully. One year when they wanted a huge number of school bonds here, they called a meeting of the important people of Mesa to meet in Sedona for a 3-day conference. And they've given great, these important people know the needs of Mesa, are going out there and hammer out the needs of the city. And so up there where the people didn't know what was going on, the legislators, nobody could fix them, only the newspapers would report, and the newspapers report what they saw and were told. But I was one of them. They divided in 4 groups, red, green, yellow, and blue. And these 4 groups were assigned to do certain things. These are the topics we want you to solve. These are the problems. You bring them back to us. And so I saw how they were being conducted. I saw through their scheme. They appointed somebody as the chairman of each one, of somebody who was part of their program and knew what to do and how to conduct it. At one point, our group was to talk about bonds and loans, and I stood up and explained the evils of bonds and property tax, and said, "That's a hell of a note," just like that. Well, all right, we work all together, all our ideas and everything come in, and this man gets them, and they take them in and compile them in a report. We come back in the plenary session, and each one of the reports is read. And they read our report, and somebody, I didn't know we said that. In other words, they had their plans all made before. I happened to walk through the back room, and the leader of the conference, somebody else, were behind the piano talking, and I didn't purposely eavesdrop, but I heard him. He said, the way we do it is we invite all these groups up, and we offer something to every one of them, so that they will support the whole program. And I saw that carried just like that. I never attended another one of their things, although I was a member of the city council. I was invited, but I just had enough of it. And after a few years, they stopped having, but for many years, they took the programs, the bonds, the taxes, the things they wanted. One of them, they said, they held a special meeting on taxes. We need more taxes. All the cities need more taxes. What can we do? And they said the is to cut taxes here. There were little taxes, cut several taxes, and raise taxes here, but don't say anything about it. So we go back and say, we have cut you all these taxes for you, but we didn't tell you that we raised the other taxes so that you're paying more than you did. Now, I'm sorry to say, but I have participated in these government programs for years. I have seen them do it. And the United Nations was formed on the same kind of deceit and planning. Let's see if I need to say any more here. Anyone familiar with the Communist Constitution of Russia will recognize the United Nations Charter a similar format. It is characterized by a fervent declaration of democratic principles, which are sound and desirable. This is then followed by constitutional restriction or procedural limitation, which completely nullifies the principles just announced. And I explained that in this wonderful Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Just lays out everything anybody could want. And then at the bottom it says, as allowed, permitted by the United Nations. And then they don't permit it. We'll finish up here. For example, the Russian Constitution provides for universal suffrage and voting by secret ballot. Then in Article 108, it provides for a single political party, the Communist Party, which will furnish the voters with a single roster of candidates. This, of course, renders completely meaningless all the high-flown phrases dealing with universal suffrage and secret ballots. Freedom of the press is likewise guaranteed and then wiped out by the provision that all writings must be in the interest of the workers, approved by the Communist Party. In precisely the same way, the United Nations Charter provides for the sovereign equality of all its members, Article 1. Then it sets up a Security Council, which is dominated by 5 permanent members: Britain, Russia, China, France, and the United States. China was excluded at first, and that's the reason I backed it up. After the China War, the China Communist takeover, China was not allowed membership, and it took them years before the other nations would agree to admit China, but China is now there. Any one of which can nullify the expressed desires of all other member nations by the simple device of exercising the veto. The Charter allows a nation to have one vote in the General Assembly. This sounds like democracy, but it provides that the General Assembly can do nothing more than make recommendations and must refer all suggestions to action. This makes the Security Council only legally binding legislative body in the UN. To make this absolutely crystal clear, the Charter provides in Article 24 that any nation which joins the UN must agree to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council. And that is total surrender of everything you have. The Charter further provides that membership in the UN shall be restricted to peace-loving states. This was thoroughly discussed at San Francisco, and Secretary John Foster Dulles has emphasized the UN was designed to be a collective organization of friendly nations to preserve peace rather than an assembly of nations in the world. In other words, the United Nations was built on the premise its members would only include those nations which had a demonstrating history of peace-loving. 8 years after the adoption of the Charter, Secretary Dulles explained to the American Bar Association why the United Nations had failed to preserve the peace. Now we see the inadequacy of an organization whose effective function depends on cooperation with a nation which is dominated by an international party seeking world dominion. Well, that's the sad story. Again, we go out or go under, but sooner or later, whether we have to go in and be rescued out, I don't know. But I still hold the fact that we are on the Lord's side and the Lord will win, and God bless you for everything you may do. Class dismissed.